Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can everybody hear me? Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. The time is now 2 p.m. and the hearing into the examination of the Brentwood local plan is resumed. Now, I did do an opening introductory statement this morning. I'm not proposing to repeat that. You'll be glad to hear. However, we do have some new participants in this session, and in other sessions we will have some new people coming in as well. So we will be providing a short summary at the beginning just of some key points. My name is Yvonne Wright, and myself and my colleague, Mr. Mike Warden. Mr. Warden, would you like to say hello?
Good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you. We've been jointly appointed by the Secretary of State under Section 20 of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act to hold this examination into the legality and soundness of the plan and to produce a report of our conclusions and recommendations on these matters. Now, you've already met Annette Feeney, who's our Programme Officer. So any questions or queries, there's Annette there, then please ask Annette directly. She's more than happy to help. Again, just a reminder, all information is available on the examination webpage and any necessary updates are going to be put up there. So please keep an eye on those. In terms of the sessions today, please ensure that your microphones are on mute unless you are invited to speak. This helps to prevent any disturbance from any background noise. Please also ensure that all mobile phones and electronic devices not being used for the virtual event are either switched off or are on silent, just so that we don't get lots of phones ringing. Please also remember to turn them back off again if we have a break this afternoon and then come back. And then if you wish to contribute to the discussions or have any questions during the session, then please can you use the raise hand function. If that isn't working, if you can wave at me, then somebody will alert me. If I don't see you, then somebody will alert me to that you wish to contribute to the discussion. So please do that. Now, just a quick reminder again, please remember that this week and including next Friday, we've called it week 1, but it does include next Friday. We are trying to focus on legal and strategic matters and more detailed matters, particularly on site allocations and policies, etc., will be dealt with at later hearing sessions, which will be at the moment are booked for February. On that note, there will be no discussions on any omission sites. We're not here to consider sites that are not in the plan, made that quite clear this morning. We will inevitably discuss different land areas when considering SA this afternoon, Sustainability Appraisal, alternatives, etc. There may be an element of discussion on that, but we're not inviting any discussions on specific omission sites. As I said this morning about in terms of the length of the sessions, we anticipate this session hopefully finishing around 4 o'clock. If it's necessary to go on beyond that, it won't go on beyond 5 o'clock, but we're hoping that it won't go on to that time. If it does, then we will have a mid-afternoon break of some time this afternoon. Those are the only sort of key points that I've got raised at the that I was going to repeat from this morning. Are there any questions from participants for this afternoon session? No. Right. On that note, then, what I would like to do is, as I did this morning, is to get all participants to introduce themselves, please, and to just so that it helps to ensure that we've got the right people around the table, or the virtual table. So can I just ask the council, please, to introduce yourselves?
Ma'am, yes. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, can I be excused from wearing a coat? It's actually freezing in here.
I was just about to say, is it rather chilly?
It's very, very cold. There's no heating at all. So forgive the odd appearance. My name is Paul Shadaridian, Queen's Counsel, acting for the council.
Thank you. And who is going to be representing from the planning officer's perspective today? Is it going to be Mr. Drain again?
Yes,
thank you.
It is, ma'am.
Thank you, Inspector Phil Drain, Director of Planning and Economy, Brentwood Council.
Thank you. From the council's perspective, is anybody else proposed to speak this afternoon?
I'm going to ask Mark Fessy, who is the author of the essays, to contribute in order to assist you, should it be helpful, Mum.
Mr. Fessy, could you just introduce yourselves, just so I can recognise you?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, my name's Mark Fessy. I'm an Associate Director with ACOM. I've worked with the Council leading on the Sustainability Appraisal for the local plan.
Lovely. Thank you for that. That just helps. OK, if I move on to, is Basildon Borough Council here? That's Mr. Davey. Is that correct? Have they not joined yet? Yeah. OK. CEG. Mr. Gimby.
Good afternoon, Ma'am. Yes, Ian Gimby, Clyde & Co, representing CEG.
Thank you. Credace Homes. Your microphone is on, Ms. Piper.
Good afternoon, Mum. I'm Jane Piper from Barton Wilmore on behalf of Credace Homes.
Thank you. Essex County Council, is that Mr. Robinson? Who's representing, or are they not here either?
Sorry, Inspector, I'm trying to get those two parties online at the moment. I will come back to you once they've arrived.
Okay, lovely, that's fine, thank you. Estates and Agency Strategic Land, Mr. Banner.
Good afternoon again, Madam, and good afternoon, Sir. Charlie Banner, QC for Strategic Land.
Lovely, thank you. Hallam Land Management, is that Mr. Hill again?
It is, ma'am. Good afternoon to you, ma'am. Good afternoon, sir. Tom Hill, Queen's Counsel for Hallam Land. Again, Mr. Gary Stevens of Marron's Planning is also on the call and available.
Thank you. St Modwen and S&J Padfield.
Good
Mr.
afternoon.
Hollingsworth.
Yes, good afternoon, Ma'am. Sam Hollingworth, Stratton Parker, representing St Modwen Development Limited and S&J Padfields and Partners, with a particular interest in the Brentwood Enterprise Park. I am also joined by my colleague James Firth. If there are any site-specific questions, I appreciate that this session is focused on strategic matters and legal compliance. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hollingsworth. Also got Tesco.
Good afternoon, Inspectors. Good afternoon. Selwyn Atkinson from GL Hearn, and I'm here on behalf of Tesco.
Thank you very much, Mr. Atkinson. Do we have Thurrock Borough Council here? Is that Mr. Hatter?
Good afternoon, Inspectors. It's Richard Hatter, Strategic Planning Manager, Thurrock Borough Council. I also have a witness speaker on behalf of Thurrock Council, which is Arena Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Hatter. Turn to us, Mr. Stebbing. Hopefully I've pronounced that correctly.
You have, Madam. Good afternoon, Inspectors. I'm representing Turn to Us and Clearbrook, who both have land interests in the plan area. And my contributions this afternoon will be in respect of both those clients. Thank you.
Okay, lovely. Thank you for clarifying that. You and I. Is that Mr. Kimberley from Chilmark?
Thank you very much, Ma'am. Good afternoon. Richard Kimberlin, Queen's Counsel. Good afternoon, sir, and good afternoon, everybody. You and I, instructed by Chilmark. Mr. Mike Taylor is also online, but on this occasion, I'm not expecting him to contribute.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Kimberlin. Right. That's the list that I've got. So is there anybody here who surreptitiously entered a session and they're wondering what is going on about? Hopefully not. I'm sure Annette has been a wonderful gatekeeper there. Right, thank you very much for that. That helps. Now, this session this afternoon is looking at other legal requirements and procedural requirements. So we had the discussion on due to cooperate this morning. So I will be looking at a sustainability appraisal, which we'll start on. Then I'll be moving on to looking at consultation. There is a couple of additional questions we've got on that. HRA, haven't got many additional questions on some of the other aspects. We do have some questions and queries on the plan period, and finishing on another. No, there shouldn't be too many further questions after we've discussed the plan period. So some of the questions are some of our MIQs. We won't be asking for further evidence or discussions on those, but we'll come to those as we move through the agenda for today. But we will, majority of the time, just be following our questions that are set out in our MIQs. So first of all, let's have a look at the sustainability appraisal. We basically wish to consider the essay in terms of whether it's been appropriately prepared in accordance with the legal requirements, because that's what we're looking at the moment. Inevitably, the essay will form part of discussions in later sessions, particularly on soundness as well, because there's obviously an overlap there. Including tomorrow. There will be elements of essay discussed tomorrow, inevitably, because it's to do with the spatial strategy. However, today we really would like to try and focus on the legal compliance of the essay and whether it has been produced in accordance and prepared in accordance with the legal requirements. Now, we're all aware that essay is a mechanism for considering and communicating likely significant effects of an emerging plan, looking at alternatives, etc., reasonable alternatives, and rejecting what are unreasonable alternatives, with a view to avoiding any mitigating adverse effects and maximising positivity through plan preparation. Now, first of all, I know a lot of issues have arisen through whether the reasonable alternatives are whether all reasonable alternatives has been properly considered. But first of all, I would like to just start with looking at the robustness of the methodology that's been used in the essay. Now, I'm not going to go, you'll be pleased to hear, going to go through the essay verbatim. There's quite a lot of it, so we're not going to be doing that at all. But what I did want to do, because I've noticed in some representations that have been made, that a couple of issues have been raised about the actual objectives that have been used, about whether cumulative effects have been taken on board, whether the scoring is objective, etc., in relation to the methodology that's been used. So I just want to focus on that first before we then move on to other aspects, including looking at reasonable alternatives. Now, just having a look at my notes. I think Mr. Hatter, Thurrock Borough Council, in some of your representations, you've raised some concerns about the essay objectives in relation to health-related aspects and how those have been assessed or have not been assessed. Is that correct, Mr. Hatter? Have I got the right end of the stick on that one?
That's correct, Mum.
What's your particular concerns on that?
Could I pass you over to my witness, Rena Davis, because that's her work. So if I just click off and Rena will come on, as I understand.
That's absolutely fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mum.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Irina Davis, and I'm a Principal Planning Officer on behalf of Thurrock Borough Council. I hope you can hear me.
We can, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. On behalf of Thurrock Borough Council, we would like to raise a couple of issues with regards to methodology of sustainability appraisal, namely assessment of human health. Human health is one of the mandatory topics stipulated in SEA directive as well as SEA regulations. And although SEA appraisal framework includes several human health related SEA objectives, the SEA report does not include meaningful analysis or a standalone human health chapter, providing an assessment of how the preferred option and reasonable alternatives perform against the above SEA objectives. Second, we would like to point out the deficiencies with regard to cumulative effects assessment. Again, cumulative effects needs to be identified, evaluated and assessed as stipulated in both SCE Regs 2004 and SCE Directive, as well as several guidance documents. For example, if I refer you to Chapter 9 of the document A3 on the cumulative effects, there is just alludence as a consideration to cumulative effects, but not any meaningful assessment is provided. Specifically, with regards to greenbelt issues, nothing was assessed. Concerns were raised previously by Thurrock Borough Council relating to potential cumulative impacts and on the gap between Upminster and Basildon, along with growth at West Hondon, Brentwood Enterprise Park and Basildon. With regards to various heritage assets, again, we do not have or can understand any information as to how meaningfully the extent to which different sites, strategic site option have effects, significant effects on heritage sites. For example, as far as we understand, currently there is heritage impact assessment ongoing, which is very well behind sustainability appraisal, and therefore sustainability appraisal could not meaningfully assess cumulative effects because the document that would eventually feed the information into SA is currently ongoing. So there is a time delay as well here. With regard to cumulative effects, the last point we would like to make is the cumulative effects on the topic of air quality. In our view, it is one of the most important and contagious topic in this assessment. For example, there is a risk of traffic from the preferred option impacting on Basildon Town Centre, planned growth and sensitive junctions in combination with other planned growth locations around the town. This may create new areas that exceed air quality limits, or delay the date on which compliance will be achieved in areas that are currently in exceedance of legal limits along A127 route in Basildon. So assessment of cumulative effect has not been done in the SA. I also would like to note that SA does not differentiate between short-term or long-term assessment, particularly with the topic of air quality that would be very beneficial. Just to sum up what I just said, will be with regards to moving forward and how to remedy that cumulative effects should form part of any subsequent review of sustainability appraisal, and whereby any ongoing technical studies could feed into this SA. And I'm alluding to health impact assessment, heritage impact assessment, and HRA, Habitat Regulation Assessment, will also was not evidently informing SA. Also, if I may, I would like to raise issue with regards to SA objectives and SA framework itself. For example, we've got a couple of SA objectives which are merely statements, as opposed to measurable objectives which are outcome-based. And therefore they do not provide an adequate tool whereby we could assess and compare the extent to which different strategic options have effect on environmental, social, and economic objectives. For example,
sorry, can I just clarify which ones you're referring to on that, or were you just about to come on to that? My apologies for interrupting.
Thank you, ma'am. I would like to give example, for example, SA objective on air quality. So SA document has a statement: air pollution and associated risks to health must be an ongoing consideration, particularly that which result from traffic congestion in Brentwood Town Centre. Well, this is a statement. This is not a measurable objective. I'll give you an example. If we were to put an objective, for example, objective would be reduce human exposure to air pollution from traffic and emissions. So we're moving towards a reduction. So any objective should be based on the SMART principles as opposed to merely statements. And this is the flaw of the SA framework, which is very important at the very beginning of the SA process. I also would like to couple of emissions. For example, we don't have a separate and very clear yet very important SA objective for Greenbelt, or for European site assessment. For example, some criteria establishing the proximity to SSSA, for example, ancient woodlands. But most important, for example, the proximity to European sites, this is not even present in the SA framework. And it's very important based on the findings of the HRA report, I believe of January 2018. Objectivity of scoring, if I may to mention a few points. When I say comparing, for example, Dunton Hills Garden Village with West Honton sites, for example, when ranking on air quality, there is an over-reliance on policy fixes to justify the scoring. For instance, the local plans encouragement of public transport, unclear whether car drivers will switch to transport or will not of its own solve air pollution problems. Well, encouragement of sustainable transport will not solve air pollution problems on their own. So therefore, in the ranking, and I'm not even saying due to the assessment of sites purely on their merit, there is a over-reliance and emphasis on policy fixes to justify the ranking, not even scoring, alone scoring. Also, we would like to allude to site assessment approach that doesn't sufficiently deal with the merits of the existing sites or assess sites on their physical characteristics that should be firstly, that should have been done by the SA, but instead relies on specific proposals of the sites. And this is very important because it creates inconsistency, as we can see throughout the whole process of SA. We have mitigation on approach, whereby we assess a site with already having in mind specific proposals on the site as mitigation, and then hence we justify the scoring more positive. That what happened, for example, in Dunton Hills Garden Village. And on the other hand, for some sites, we use mitigation of approach, where we merely look at the physical characteristics of the site. We do not take any mitigation into consideration, and we assign a negative scoring to the site. Well, this is not very transparent in our view, and the council, where the council references developer proposals to conclusions on the sustainability, they should have been transparent where such information was used and any uncertainties associated with it. Because the reason being why I'm highlighting it, both SEA directives and regulations stipulate that preferred option and all reasonable alternative, they should be assessed and they should be evaluated equally. So not given preference one side or another, and to avoid this bias, if you like. Also, if I may, according to SA, Dunton Hill Garden Village option 3 performs notably well, as it is considered to be relatively unconstrained in biodiversity terms. Well, this is a contradiction to the assessment results in Appendix 3, page 110 of the A3 document, where the site scored very poorly. In fact, it is only colored red against SSSI's ancient woodland and local wildlife site criteria. So this is an example of when SA uses a mitigation on assessment approach to justify the scoring of option 3, Dunton Hill Garden Village, where it takes into account mitigation measures such as delivering biodiversity net gain. It is noted by Thurrock Borough Council that there is little reference to potential mitigation measures, for example, for air quality or biodiversity for the option in Brentwood urban area, which could have reduced significant negative effects and result in better scoring. Moreover, as per Habitat Regulation Assessment Report, January 2018, all site allocations identified in the plan allocated within at least one recreational zone of influence, and new residential development within this location could result in an adverse effect upon the integrity of the European sites. As I mentioned previously, SA framework does not contain a separate SA objective for distances or for impacts, adverse impacts, likelihood of them on European site. The closest site, in fact, is allocated in Dunton Hills Garden Village. According to the Habitat Regulation Assessment, it is located 8.3 kilometers from the Thames Estuary and Marshes SPA and Ramsar site. which potentially can cause a recreational disturbance. However, it's not even a criteria in the SA report to compare site performances.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. Anything else?
Thank you very
much. Okay.
I've got points, but I could pause here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. I want to, there's quite a lot that I think the council needs to respond on that. Mr. Kimblin, you've got your hand up. Is it on some of the points that Ms. Davis has raised? Oh,
it is.
Feedback there. So, Mr. Kimblin, I'll bring you in and then I will go to the council for a response because quite a few points have been raised there. So, Mr. Kimblin, please.
Yes, thank you very much. And I want to, if I may, echo and develop some of the points which have been made with such detail and force just then. What we heard at the outset was in respect of criteria and objectives. And I want just to say something about the question of ranking, because that is one key approach in the SA. From our point of view, we have no criticism to make of the use of ranking. It's plainly very helpful in understanding the relationship as between one option and another. But I think I would like to associate myself with what's just been said because it doesn't go far enough. What we have, it's correct to say, is a lot of assertions. What we don't have is the material which then goes further, in which Regulation 9 and Schedule 1, particularly paragraph 1A, requires and 1B requires, because we're setting here something which sets the framework for decisions in the future. It's a very important step. And what paragraph 2 in Schedule 1 then goes on to require is that you've got to look at the extent, the magnitude, the special characteristics, particularly expressly said so in respect of heritage. And that's what we're missing in the SA. And that goes to this whole question which Ms. Davis was dealing with first of all. We don't get any proper assessment of many environmental compartments. One that was picked up on in particular was heritage. And one sees in respect of heritage exactly the point which has just been made, which is that to a degree it's being done backwards. All that one has in the SA is something which is not far away from the baseline. We've got a description of what one finds. One has a designation, but one doesn't have what one would expect, namely a real understanding of what the significance of the asset is, the extent to which setting contributes towards that, whether or not any of that matters. The next point I'd like to pick up on and develops a little bit further is what was referred to by Ms. Davis was the question of mitigation. And that flows from the heritage point, because of course it may be perfectly possible in any particular case to mitigate the effects. But when the SA is considering those issues, it must be done on a consistent basis. That's what the Commission guidance says. And it's fairly obvious in any event. And when one looks at the way in which heritage is approached, it's not on a consistent basis for certain sites and options, mitigation very much taken into account. The phrase that was used was to use policy fixes, and I agree with that. Whereas what should be happening is a consistent basis used for the whole purpose is to get to the point where one has the ability to understand what the environmental effects are. And then it may be that the best option is not taken forward for a perfectly good reason, but then you're able to weigh the reason given against the actual environmental effects produced. The last point that I'd just like to pick up on at this stage from what has just been said is in respect of cumulative effects. So cumulative effects were frankly criticised by Ms. Davis just now, and I would associate myself with that quite strongly. The assessment of cumulative effects is required again by Regulation 9 and Schedule 1. It's a legal requirement. The assessment in the SA is 372 words long. And so far as environmental criteria are concerned, deals only with landscape and biodiversity. So one can instantly think of everything else just not dealt with. And that's particularly startling in the context of a plan which is still just at this moment grappling with the transport assessment with necessary implications as far as air quality are concerned, which of course itself feeds into cumulative assessment. So the importance of this point is that one doesn't fully understand the cumulative effects, the relationship with what's going on next door with neighbours. Of course, lastly, these things are remediable. They can be remedied. They're not, while they are legal deflects, because one has the regulations, one has the schedule, that's what's required. It is material which can be put right. And that's the last thing I'll say on that topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kimblin. I was going to go to the council first in response, and then I'll come back to you, Mr. Banner, if that's okay. Or is this a general?
It's a similar point, Madam. Very quickly. I mean, firstly, I want to associate myself with what Mr. Kimblin has just said and the aspects of Ms. Davis's comments that he's referred to. Our concerns, as expressed in paragraphs 3.1 to 3.3 of the hearing statement in relation to the scoring, are really in a similar vein. The essential point that's set out there is that the ranking approach overlooks the magnitude and spatial extent of the effects, which are under the directive and regulations, inherent component parts of an assessment of likely significant effects. So not only does that mean that what the legislation requires to be looked at hasn't been, or certainly hasn't been spelt out, if it has been looked at, it hasn't been set out, but also there's an oversimplification. And that's really seems to me to be a sort of pervading theme of what Ms. Davis and Mr. Kimblin have just said. And it's that oversimplification which may very well have led to our second methodological concern in relation to the appraisal designations. I don't propose to add anything. You've got what we've said about that in our hearing statement 3.8 to 3.10, that triple SIs and list of buildings have been overlooked. And it may very well be for similar reasons. So therefore there's like a golden thread running through those methodological concerns.
Thank you, Mr. Banner. Right, I'm going to go to the council. So, Mr. Shadarevian, who is going to respond from the council's perspective? There's quite a few points raised there.
So sorry, I was talking on mute. Can you hear me now?
I couldn't see you, so I didn't know. So right.
I said there are a myriad of points mentioned there by Thurrock, and I'm afraid I cannot locate all of those points in their representations. So I'd like Mr. Fessy to have some time to consider the points which have been made. Overall, the basic response to these matters is that the SA, as formulated in 2016, 2018 and 2019, follows a pretty standard format and employs a pretty standard methodology which has been used time and time again for other authorities and their plans. Now, the object of the SA exercise actually is not to present something which is over complex, but is intended to look at the alternatives and assess the relative impacts of those alternatives on an agreed matrix. And the matrix which is employed in this case is entirely appropriate. There is, I would say, two things about some of the points which have been made, particularly in relation to cumulative impacts. Cumulative impacts, and I'll ask Mr. Fessy to explain how it's been done, have been dealt with in the body of the SA, and they have informed the scoring in relation to the impacts of all sites which have been assessed and the options which derive from those sites and the way in which they have been clustered to provide a basis for meeting the objectives, the strategic objectives of the plan. There is nothing wrong with the way in which that has been done. Secondly, in relation to weighting, it is appropriate for the SA to score relative impacts in relation to those categories, and it's done so. Others may not agree with that scoring, but that is a matter of judgment. New inspectors will also make a judgment in relation to that when you come to consider it. The idea that you should exclude consideration of mitigation when one is dealing with a policy on document is extraordinary. If one cannot take into account the capacity of a site to mitigate its impacts, then it makes a nonsense of one's approach, provided that is explained to the reader, which it is in this particular case. So again, the observation is nice, but actually it doesn't indicate that there's been a failure, a legal failure in the production and consideration of the environmental effects for the purposes of this plan through the SA process which has been employed. So on that basis, I'm going to ask Mr. Fessy, if I may, just to answer the point about cumulative impacts, and then we can start to think about some of the other points which have been raised.
Thank you. Mr. Fessy, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Mum. So we're interested in Regulation 12 and its associated Schedule 2, which does list cumulative effects as something that should be considered as part of the process of arriving at conclusions on likely significant effects. So just on a technicality, we're not interested in Regulation 9 and associated Schedule 1, but that's a minor point. So with cumulative effects essentially means giving consideration to larger than local and long-term considerations. That has been a central feature of the SA process for the Brentwood Local Plan, both as part of the process of arriving at reasonable alternatives, appraising reasonable alternatives, and appraising the emerging preferred option, or emerging draft plan. There are many references throughout the appraisal findings that are essentially dealing with larger than local and long-term considerations, so i.e. cumulative effects, taking into account what we might foresee in respect of the South Essex local plan, Thurrock local plan, Basildon local plan in particular. Then at the end of section 9, which is the section of the SA report that presents an appraisal of the draft plan, there is a paragraph with some associated bullet points on cumulative effects. So that section is a one-page conclusion to the draft plan appraisal. It's not aiming to present the last word on cumulative effects by any means. It's the 4 bullet points are simply describing 4 topics in terms of which there naturally needs to be discussion of cumulative effects. I might leave things there, but I have listed out those 4 bullet points, and I can elaborate on specific cumulative effects that are discussed within the appraisal in respect of each of those 4 bullet points. But that's what I'd like to say on cumulative effects.
Thank you. Mr. Shadaravian, did you want to come back on some of the other points that were raised in relation to the scoring and the health-related SA objectives? Or is that something that I need to ask Mr. Fessy?
I think that's something, I'm not a technical expert, I'm happy to say at this juncture, but I think it's something Mr. Fessy ought to be asked about. But can I just say something about the weighting as well? It's not for the compiler of the essay to weight the various categories. It's a matter for the decision maker having regard to the relative impacts identified by the scoring mechanism used, to make a choice. It's not for the SA to say, well, certain environmental impacts should be afforded greater weight than others. That is not the function of the SA. And indeed, it would be wrong for the SA to make any such assumption in that regard, because it usurps the function of the decision maker, making planning judgments. So that's the only point I'd make about that. If I'll ask Mr. Fessy if he can assist further in relation to the issue of public health. Are you able to do so? He nods. I'll switch off.
I can see him nodding in the background. So yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sheridan.
Thank you.
Mr. Fessy.
Okay, so first point to make around general points on methodology. So there are two methodology sections in the report. One talking about the methodology section in respect of appraising reasonable alternatives, and the other one in respect of appraising the draft plan. But the text is very similar in both those sections. And as part of that methodology discussion, we explained that we do naturally need to take into account Schedule 2 of the SEA regulations, which links to the all-important Regulation 12, and specifically what Schedule 2 does, it sets out the information to be provided in the environmental report, which we take to be the information required of the SA report. So the point was made that there's a mandatory requirement to consider health. So actually that point relates to Schedule 2.6. And there's actually no mandatory requirement to do anything. The regulations are of a procedural nature rather than substantive nature. And what Schedule 2.6 actually says is to consider significant effects, and I now quote, including, I'm quoting off the top of my head, including in terms of such issues as, and then it lists a number of substantive environmental topics, including health. So the important term is including issues such as. So it's a technicality and slightly academic point, but I do take issue with the suggestion that there's a mandatory requirement. Second point is the SA framework has been established since 2013, when there was the scoping stage was completed, including consultation on the scoping report. All 5 of the subsequently prepared interim SA reports, it might be 4, the subsequently prepared interim SA reports published at the Regulation 18 stage, all or most of them included a specific request to give us comments on the SA scope. I will really quickly take you to the paragraph in the final interim SA report, which is the January 2018 one, or early 2018. And the relevant paragraph is 4.2.1, where we use bold text to communicate that we, despite the fact that the SA framework has been established since 2013, we remain open to ideas. It never need be fixed and set in stone. It's only natural that your understanding of the SA scope and evidence and key issues, etc., should evolve over time. I'm certain that we never received any suggestion from Thurrock Council or anyone else that we should amend the SA framework so that there's a greater degree of focus on health. And yes, so that's a key point I think I'd like to make. And so what is the SA framework? It's a list of 12 topics, and under each topic are at least two, sometimes several objectives. And our approach all the way through at each stage of the SA process has been to appraise under the list of 12 topics. So whether that be the appraisal of reasonable alternatives, which generates your classic appraisal matrix, or the appraisal of the draft plan, which is presented in the form of narratives, one for each topic. So as I say, our approach all the way through has been to appraise under those 12 topic headings, taking into account the underlying objectives only as necessary. So what I think you're looking at over 30 objectives. I haven't tallied them, I'm afraid. But what we don't do, and what we never have done, is to systematically appraise in respect of each and every one of the objectives. So that's the other point I'd like to make on the SA framework and health in particular. I'll leave things there, unless there's anything else you'd like me to come back on at all.
No, I'd like to bring in some other people. Thank you for that, Mr. Fessy. I will bring in Mr. Banner, and then I'll come to Mr. Hollingworth, because you've both had your hands up. So Mr. Banner first, please.
Thank you, Madam. I just wanted to come back on one point that you, Mr. Fessy just said, which is we're not concerned with Regulation 9 and Schedule 1. If you take that at face value, there's very high risk that will result in a legal error. Regulation 9 is clearly concerned with screening and whether there are likely significant environmental effects that need to be assessed. And in Schedule 1 sets out what are the things that have to be considered in assessing whether there are likely significant effects that need to be assessed. And as we've made clear in our hearing statement for this matter, one of those things is the magnitude and spatial extent of the effects, and we've set that out in our hearing statement, quoted it, and you've got the reference there. And if it's really being said in response to our complaint that that's not then dealt with in the assessment, well, that's only relevant to screening. Once you've screened it, you don't have to consider it. That's unquestionably an error of law, because if the magnitude and spatial extent is a relevant factor in determining whether there are likely significant effects that need to be looked at and need to be assessed, to then proceed in the assessment itself not to consider them, it is to omit a factor which was relevant to the very reason why you need to do the assessment in the first place. So to say that the Schedule 2 considerations are immaterial is an error of law, and I suggest you ought to be deeply troubled that that's the basis on which Mr. Fessy has proceeded to do his analysis in his own terms just now. And note that Mr. Shalarevian's typically eloquent response to the concerns didn't seek to grapple with our complaint that the magnitude and spatial effect of the magnitude and spatial extent of the effects has not been looked at in the essay due to this oversimplistic ranking approach.
Thank you, Mr. Banner. I am going to go to Mr. Hollingworth before I come back to the council. Mr. Hollingworth, please.
Thank you, Mum. It was just a brief point, and apologies if I'm stepping on the council's toes here, but it was further to Mr. Fessy's comments around the establishment of the essay framework and the essay objectives. And that was just to say that it was my understanding from reading the essay that not only was that prepared in consultation generally, including with Thurrock Council, but also with the consultation bodies, including Natural England, Historic England and the Environment Agency. As Mr. Fessy explained very early on in that process, and it has and they've been open to further modifications to that as it progressed, which is entirely appropriate. And I think on that basis, I can't see how there can be any question over the appropriateness of that essay framework or the objectives then subsequently used, and particularly not from a legal compliance perspective, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hollingworth. Thank you. Can I come back to the council on this point? Because I do want to move on, because obviously we're only looking at the framework itself, because I do want to look at reasonable alternatives. Can I come to the council for a response on that, on those points that have been made, please?
Yes, Mum. So far as Mr. Fessy's comments about the regulations is concerned, that shouldn't be misconstrued as saying it doesn't matter and it wasn't considered. Those were considered. What I find difficult, actually, in this discussion is to be able to focus exactly on what the complaints are, because they're spoken of in general terms. We failed to do this, we failed to do that. But if you actually drill down into the nature of the complaint, and I asked Mr. Banner this actually through indirectly, as it were, what is it that's missing that wasn't done? What is it about the spatial effects that were not considered? Because, you know, if this thing is capable of being, if there is a fault and it's capable of being cured, then we should be looking to do so. But to stand there and criticize a process which has taken a long time, to which all consultees have been party at this stage, to say, well, it's weak in this way and it's weak in another, deserves actually to be particularized to some extent, so that we know how it might be cured if there is a defect. And I'm grateful to Mr. Kimblin to identify the fact that procedurally, if there are errors, then they can be corrected. So let's understand what they are, and to see whether or not they actually do have substance.
Thank you, Mr. Shadorevian. Mr. Banner.
See our hearing statement. We set them out in our hearing statement. I was following the appropriate procedure, which is not to read passages out. Paragraphs 3.1, 3.2 and 3.3. We have the author of those paragraphs on the call, Mr. Mills, who can elaborate if you've got any questions. But I haven't been generalised. I'm simply not repeating what's set out in writing in accordance with good practice.
Mr. Kimblin.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Likewise, full particularisation in the hearing statement and the appended opinion which goes with it. One really must be very careful not to take the council's response uncritically, because what you've had in response is a general traverse, which is essentially to say what has been done is appropriate because it's been done elsewhere. That doesn't really help. So, for example, when the question of heritage has been used as a vehicle for explaining what the particular point is, there's been no engagement with that, either from Mr. Fessy nor from Mr. Shadorevian. So we are in a situation where particular examples have been provided in the hearing statements from a number of parties, quite independently of each other, and you haven't received a response. And some of the points have been materially misunderstood, I have to say. So, for example, so far as we've dealt with the question of mitigation, the council is entirely right to point out that it is not the correct approach to ignore mitigation. That's entirely correct. But the point is a different one. The point is that assessment of effects is to be done on a consistent basis, and the inconsistencies are identified by Thurrock in their hearing statement. So misunderstanding the point doesn't really advance this question of legal correctness of the essay or the SEA part of it. And so we still are waiting really for responses to those points.
Thank you, Mr. Kimblin. I think what I would like to understand, and it's probably from Mr. Fessy, is just using heritage as an example to understand how that aspect has actually been assessed as part of the essay, without going into great depth, to just give us an understanding, to make sure that we are reading the information correctly as to under which objectives has that been considered. You obviously have a heritage, cultural sort of heritage objective, but how has the consideration of the built heritage been taken into account under that, as part of the essay, for instance, just so that we fully understand the issues, because we're hearing different issues from different sides or different concerns. So, Mr. Fessy.
Thank you, Mum. Okay, so section 3 of the report, of the essay report, as published and submitted, presents our essay framework, and there is a topic called cultural heritage, under which we explore heritage-related considerations. Then within part 1, which is the part of the report which deals with reasonable alternatives, it's section 6 that presents a summary appraisal of the reasonable alternatives, with the detail presented in Appendix 6 at the back at the end of the report. And then subsequently, it's section 9 within part 2, where we present our appraisal of the draft plan. So there's a section within a subsection within section 6 which deals with cultural heritage. And if I might take you to the appraisal of the reasonable alternatives under the heritage topic within Appendix 6 of the essay report. So that is on page. Begins on page 125. So I'll just give you a moment to get to that point.
Okay. Yeah, I'm there. Yep.
Okay, so there's the appraisal is presented as a narrative where we discuss, we use bold text to highlight the flow of the narrative. We begin with a discussion of the A127 corridor. Key first sentence there. It's relatively unconstrained in heritage terms. I won't go on. Then we have the second paragraph deals with Dunton Hills Garden Village. You see discussion of it begins with the fact that there is a single grade 2 listed building within the sites, and then the discussion goes on. I do want to get to the final couple of paragraphs, which are essentially the conclusions. But if we turn over the page to page 126, the first paragraph deals with the Brentwood urban area, because some of our reasonable alternatives would involve high growth around the Brentwood urban area, and so that's essentially what's explored in that paragraph. But if we then read through in detail the final paragraph, which is the conclusion, we learn that West Horndon West is, so of the emission sites that feature in the reasonable alternatives, it's West Horndon West, or west of West Horndon, is considered to be the least constrained location, followed by Dunton Hills Garden Village. This leads to a conclusion that options 3 and 6 perform best because they would involve a focus of growth at those two sites and would avoid growth at the more constrained sites. So the second sentence then reads, options 4 and 7 perform poorly as there would be a risk of impacts to 2 conservation areas, brackets, one of which is also a registered park and garden, and several listed buildings. So options 3, so I think that's a typo actually. It should read option 2 and 6, sorry. Oh no, I'm getting confused. Let me start that sentence again. It reads options 4 and 7 perform poorly. And so to be clear, option 4 and option 7 will both involve growth at the Brentwood urban area.
Yes.
Okay. However, it is not possible to conclude significant negative effects, even after having considered the impacts that will result from preferred allocations that are a constant across the reasonable alternatives. Because it's important to remember that these are essentially growth scenarios, all of which would involve, in addition to the sites that are a variable across reasonable alternatives, they would also involve the sites that are constant across reasonable alternatives. So we need to be alive to those sites as well. So, but even after having taken into account those sites, some of which will be constrained in historic environment terms, it's still not possible to conclude significant negative effects. Take into account the potential to avoid, mitigate effects through careful master planning and design. Brackets, for example, West Horndon East, the site promoters have submitted a scheme that seeks to respond to the heritage constraints that exist. And then the final sentence, greatest concern potentially relates to the setting of wheeled conservation area / registered park and garden and associated specific assets, which are listed buildings in a scheduled ancient monument. So that's what that sentence probably should have gone on to spell out is what that means is one of the 4 Brentwood urban area emission sites that feature in the reasonable alternatives, specifically the one furthest to the northwest, which we refer to through the essay as west of Ongar Road. We are saying that's the most constrained site in heritage terms. So I would suggest that what that concluding paragraph does, it's at its minimum a 2-step process. Firstly, differentiating or ranking the alternatives, so placing them in an order of preference without getting hung up on effect significance, and then going on to explore effect significance, or the significance of effects, and then finally arriving at that ultimate conclusion about whether we feel a threshold is reached such that it necessitates a red score. And we decide that whilst there are obvious, as we say, clear negative effects, that we don't believe that threshold is reached, and so we don't conclude significant negative effects. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Okay, anything further on that particular point in relation to the frameworks? I want to move on to in relation to the methodology that's been used. Because what I want to move on to now is our question 2B, and generally our general sort of questions in relation to reasonable alternatives. It's not just about 2B, it's some of our other questions about the different alternatives that have been considered. And our key question. Our key questions are about has the essay adequately considered the appropriate sort of reasonable alternatives or significant effects of reasonable alternatives, and have the unreasonable alternatives that have been looked at been adequately have appropriate reasons been given? Have they been adequately set out within the essay to consider why they weren't taken forward any further? So I know that some people around the table have raised concerns about reasonable alternatives in particular. Now, I don't want to, again, I will reiterate, I don't want to go down the route of sites and specific sites and why this site wasn't included and that site wasn't included, because that's not the question. This is about the legal compliance of whether appropriate reasonable alternatives have been assessed and whether unreasonable alternatives, their reasons for rejection are clear. So the council is obviously saying yes, it's very clear. So Mr. Banner, if I can come to you first.
Thank you, Madam. And again, in line with previous practice, I won't read out or repeat verbatim what's in writing, but I suggest that a critical issue in relation to reasonable alternatives relates to the failure to consider a higher than, I think, if I was 517, I think I've got the figure right, housing requirement figure. And the key points in relation to that, I suggest, are firstly that at page 42 of the essay, and by the essay I mean the main one, the need for a buffer is recognised. I haven't got that before because I've only got a laptop, so I can't see if I get it up before me. It's 42, and the need for about, it's the third from last bullet, the need for a buffer is recognised, but the highest that buffer goes is to the 517 figure, and I suggest that a higher figure, that higher figure or figures than that were, or certainly now are, reasonable alternatives. Of course, unlike the duty to cooperate, for the same reasons that SA failures are remediable ordinarily, it's an ongoing duty until the point of the plan's adoption. And the critical points here are firstly, there is the need has gone up. So at the time of the SA, it was 350, and it might go up to 454, they say. I think that might be a typo, 452, it matters not, it's only 2 homes. But the need has gone, is now definitely the higher figure. So the buffer at the time of the SA was looked at against a current figure of 350. And obviously things have been upscaled since then, but no upscaling of the outer parameter of the buffer. The second point is there's a greater reliance on Dunton Hills, and increased number of dwellings earmarked there. And of course, the relevance of that is that the plan as a whole is therefore all the greater on the deliverability and the timely deliverability and delivery of that one site. You know, in gambling terms, is putting, if not all the chips on black, a very large amount of them. And thirdly, an associated point is there's a document, F26. I'm afraid I can't tell you the date of that off the top of my head. It's the council's updated trajectory, but it is important. If you've got the ability to look at it now, that might be helpful. But if you don't, I'll give you the key references. And that's the council's November 2020 updated trajectory. And if you get, have you got that, Madam? There's 2 pages I need to refer you to. It's the very, very last page, first of all, page 6 out of 6. And you see that what's happened is that the... Just
bear with me, it's just loading.
Sorry.
So just...
Last thing I'll do is crash the system by having everything done. So...
Okay, so what page were you wanting me to look at?
Page 6 of 6 is the first of the 2 pages that I need to refer you to. And if you'll see there, what's happened in relation to Dunton is that the judgment as to the likely delivery trajectory of that has been quite substantially reduced downwards. from 2770 over the plan period until to 1950 as a result of a downgraded annual delivery rates. So
yes, we're aware of that.
And what that's resulted in, if we go then to page 2 of the PDF, which is the updated trajectory, is now and this is relevant to it. I know we'll come back to it in due course in the housing session, but the net homes to be delivered over the plan period it is 7376, and as I understand it, that's less than the overall requirement. I may be, which is the SPO2 is for 7752. So irrespective of the precise numbers, what all these things show, both individually but most importantly in combination, is that the need or the importance of looking at buffers beyond the outer limit that were looked at, given the various factors I've referred to, the uplifting of need, the greater reliance on Dunton, and the issues about deliverability of Dunton, that those higher numbers, even if they weren't reasonable alternatives when the plan was initially subject to SA, they most certainly are now. And a failure to look at them and test them would be a failure to have regard to a reasonable alternative, bearing in mind that in this context we're looking at an ongoing duty. Two very, very quick final points. Thirdly, what I've said this morning about unmet needs is an SA point in a sense as well as duty to cooperate. I'll simply say that, but the points I made this morning apply if not in the duty to cooperate context, then in terms of reasonable alternatives. In fact, they were ruled out on the inadequate ground of the JSP. And finally, it may be, depending on the context, that document, the report on the strategic review, throws up SEA issues. Or I won't say any more than that, but just to flag up that you may need to bolt on to your consideration of the issues we're discussing today, that in that context, because it may beg questions about
I am aware of that, because of that evidence, but until we've seen that evidence, we don't.
So we know what it is. We don't know. We
Quite
can't
sure
say any more.
what it involves,
Absolutely. Just to flag up, it may sound in this context too. Thank you, madam.
Thank you. Now I've got several hands up, so can I bring in Mr. Hill, and then I will come to Mr. Stebbing. Mr. Hill first, please.
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, and our point you will have seen from the hearing statement is one of soundness of the methodology, and we're not seeking to pick over the merits of individual sites at this stage. It really comes under, I think, your reasonable alternatives heading, although most of the text is actually set out under your sub-question A rather than D. So, ma'am, if you're happy to look back to what we've said under A, that would greatly assist. If I can just elaborate those points very quickly for you without reading out any part of what we've already placed before the examination. I don't know whether you've got access to the essay in its full form immediately to hand. I was just going to refer you to a few points in the document itself. And now I should make it absolutely plain. This isn't a counsel of perfection so far as Hallam is concerned. This is a broad issue of the robustness of the methodology, and we do say that the essay has fallen down in a material way, in the way essentially that it has grouped together all of the Brentwood options under one head and tested them for the purposes of the essay as a single entity. And if we look at the page 28 of the internal pagination of the essay, you will see, I'm afraid, as is often the case, the page number on the page is not the same as the page number in the PDF, but there we are. I'm going to refer to the page numbering on the document itself, on the face of the document, rather than the PDF number.
Yeah,
if we look at
table
5.2, which is headed up. Headed up final shortlist of Brentwood main urban area emission sites. and you'll see the analysis of these sites. 4 of these sites, High Pot Lane, Sawyers Hall Farm, St Faith's and Landolph-Ongar Road, are the ones that are taken forward essentially for the Brentwood assessment. They're very different sites, they're in different places, they're promoted by different parties, they're very different characteristics, as I'm sure you've already seen. Those sites then feed through into table 5.5 on page 33. If one looks again at that internal pagination rather than that of the PDF, that's table 5.5. The reasonable spatial strategy alternatives. And those 4, one can see from the second column in from the left, are the Brentwood sites. Everything above those 4 sites is a constant for the purposes of the essay, and the variables are in the slightly darker blue colouring. So the Brentwood sites, all 4 of them, High Pot, Sawyers Hall, St Faith's and West-Ongar Road, are all grouped together, and one has in fact 2,200 units there, all being grouped together and considered together for the purposes of the essay. 200, 450, 750 and 800. So it's about a third of the total supply, and it's a very significant sum to be treating as a single variable, not subdivided. Below, one has West Horndon East, 600, that's tested independently. West Horndon West, 900, that's tested independently. And of course, Dunton Hills, which is a large site, which is what it is. And that's also
so your point is that there is no justification for the Brentwood sites to be clumped together and only tested as a group rather than tested individually.
Indeed, tested, or perhaps there might be a justification for a smaller grouping, but putting 2,200 units scattered across the outer edge of the Brentwood urban area and lumping them all together, notwithstanding their varying characteristics, doesn't give you a robust methodology. The following series of figures, ma'am, you can see how the 7 options that were examined, you either flick on or off the Brentwood sites. And as I say, I won't ask you to do that, but if you look through those figures, you can see that they're either on or off. There isn't any subdivision at all. And then when one gets to the conclusions, page 42, the Brentwood urban options are all dealt with in the same way. The table is dealt with on the basis that the Brentwood sites operate as a group and as a single cohort. So our point is there's a need for a finer grained analysis, and a site such as my client's site, 800 units, warrants to be tested separately, just as West Horndon West and West Horndon East were tested separately. That's the extent of the point. I'm not seeking to probe the merits beyond that. It's a question of structure, methodology, and whether that's been done in an appropriate way.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the council whether you want to respond on those points, or if I can go to Mr. Stebbing first.
Well, I wonder
Shadow Revian, do you want to respond on a couple of points?
To Mr. Hill's points, which he puts very well, but I'd just like to respond to them, please, as a matter in terms of their merit and the implications of what's been suggested. It is true they were grouped together. And I expect Mr. Fessy can provide you with greater detail than I, but they were grouped together. One, because of their geographic location relative to the urban area, firstly. Secondly, because in performing a strategic function, it was appropriate to take them together in terms of the number of houses they could provide and the amount of infrastructure which grouped sites could provide in order to provide a sustainable community. So the rationale was entirely reasonable, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really affect the assessment outcome of Mr. Hill's client's site, because all of the individual sites have been assessed in the essay, and one can see how they perform relative to each other. So grouping them as we have hasn't actually affected the scoring which attaches to his client site, which, if I'm wrong, Mr. Hill, tell me, but I think it's 302C, is that right?
Yes.
Yes. If one looks at the way it performs relative to the others in the same batch or group, it actually performs less well than the others. And one can see that actually when one looks through the various tables. Just bear with me.
Ma'am, I deliberately haven't looked at the scores or indeed sought to pore over the merits of the sites for reasons you've explained.
I understand that. And
we have our own separate disagreements with those.
Yeah, I understand that also, but in terms of giving the full picture to you, Ma'am, and your fellow inspector, if one turns to, for example, the tables beginning, just bear with me, page 6, page 97 onwards of the essay. You don't need to go there now. But you will see there the individual sites are identified and they are given shadings according to their relative impacts as against the various categories which have been assessed. So had those sites been disaggregated, one has to ask the question, well, why would you want to do that? Unless one were looking slightly to increase the housing supply. Why would you want to do that? Why would you want to include them as constants when they're being tested, as it were, against other strategic options? And what number of permutations is it appropriate and reasonable to take into account in bringing forward an appraisal of the plan, which deals with its broader environmental, social and policy impacts? And my answer to that is, and my submission is, well, you don't need to disaggregate them in order to get a clear picture of what kind of contribution they will make.
Thank you, Mr. Shadaravian. Mr. Stebbing, please. Is Mr. Stebbing here?
Can you hear me now, ma'am?
I can, yes, Mr. Stebbing.
I'm making a number of points which cut across your questions B, C, D, and E, which I think in many respects the questions are linked.
They are.
Because it is about the generation of reasonable alternatives, as you say, and the rejection of unreasonable alternatives. It's clear to me that the plan has the SA has adopted a seeding approach to sites, rather like the Wimbledon Tennis Championships, and the #1 seed is Dunton Hills Garden Village, and yet, as I think Miss Davis pointed out at the beginning of the afternoon, in Appendix 3, the Dunton Hills site doesn't fare particularly well. Nevertheless, that and a number of other sites have, as we've just heard, have become constants. And the reasonable alternatives stem from that. And my first point is, has Appendix 3 actually any relevance to the generation of reasonable alternatives? And conversely, has Appendix 3 any relevance, in fact, to the testing of sites that all fall within, presumably, unreasonable alternatives, of which my client's sites are just 2? So, for example, why have we not tested one or maybe more village expansion alternatives. We haven't. And that stems from, you've used the word predetermined in your question, and I fear it has been predetermined that Dunton Hills will come out as the #1 seed, and therefore there is a limit, because of Dunton Hill's strategic size, on what other reasonable alternatives need to be tested and whether or not they perform any better. That's the germ of my point, Ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Stebbing. Can I have council response, please? Is it going to be Mr. Shadorevian or Mr. Messi?
Yes, ma'am. I'll help as far as I can. The SA process, first of all, has been entirely transparent. There is no doubt about that. And the options which have been put forward, the alternatives which have been put forward, have been appraised appropriately. It's not true to say, when one takes everything into account in terms of the scoring and the impacts, that option 3 scores less well than any of the other options. Of course it does in relation to a couple of aspects, but it's inevitable that a proposal will fare less well than others in certain respects. It's the way it is. But this demonstrates how objective the assessment has been. The fact that Dunton has been an option on its own for a considerable period of time doesn't indicate predisposition, or that the assessment process has been skewed in its favour. Quite clearly, the assessments can be seen at face value for what they are, which is an objective basis for assessing the options which have been chosen. As for other options, putting aside the issue of disaggregation at the moment, the reasons for not going for further village expansions, and there are those which are allocated in the plan, is simply because of the lack of infrastructure support those communities, and the fact, actually, and as you heard in the opening statement to this examination, one of the key characteristics of the borough is that it is a borough of villages, and maintaining that identity and the identity of the existing villages was an important consideration in the way in which the spatial strategy was derived. One makes no secret of that fact. So I think that's all I'm able to say about Mr. Stebbing's observations at this stage.
Thank you, Mr. Shadorevian. I would like some clarification on the use of constants within the essay. I understand the council's response in relation to, or I've read the council's response saying that they've explained that this is to avoid an inordinate amount of reasonable alternatives to consider. But I'm trying to just understand, was a consideration given to not having those constants, and what impact that would have had on the essay and different spatial strategy options? Was that?
I'll ask Mr. Fest to deal with it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Ma'am. So section 5 of the essay report, which deals with establishing reasonable alternatives, is about 30 pages in length, and there's about 35 pages of appendices attached to it. And feeding into section 5 is a process, an iterative process stretching back over a number of years at the Regulation 18 stage. So I feel we've gone through a very exhaustive process to arrive at reasonable alternatives. And just briefly, the legal requirement as set out in Schedule 2 of the SEA regulations is that there's a requirement to present an outline of the reasons for selecting the alternatives dealt with. And so just briefly, I do believe we've met that legal requirement. But now, going on to the substantive points. So what section 5 does, it presents a process, and there's a flow diagram to explain that process. At the start is figure 5.1. And I always describe that as a top-down and bottom-up process with a middle layer of analysis as a penultimate step before you finally establish your reasonable alternatives. So essentially, what we ultimately arrive at is that there should be 7 sites that are variables across reasonable alternatives, and the one of which is an allocation, 6 of which are emission sites, and that the other allocations should be held constant. And then the very final step in the process is we apply 3 rules about how you package up those 7 variable sites. Just briefly, those 3 rules are: firstly, east of West Horndon should not and could not come forward in combination with Dunstan Hills Garden Village. That's rule 1. Rule two is that
I have read the rules. I understand the rules.
Yeah.
What I'm not understanding is why, because it doesn't seem to be any narrative within the essay about why there are constants. Now, if you can point me to that narrative so that I can understand why there are constants, then please do so.
I don't think there's a paragraph in the essay report that sets that out, but what we're very clear, and we're clear in section 4 of the essay report, and there's absolute equivalent wording in the previous 2 interim essay reports, is that our aim is to arrive at site-specific reasonable alternatives. And I do believe the legal requirement amounts, when it comes to local plans, I believe the legal requirement to explore reasonable alternatives means essentially alternative packages of sites. And just briefly, I did try to use some A-level maths combinations calculators early this week, but it's not as easy as I'd hoped. But a couple of numbers for you here is that if we'd accepted the constant but looked to explore all of the combinations of the 7 variables, there would have been 128 reasonable alternatives. And second and final number for you, if we'd applied 2 of the 3 final rules, specifically not applied the rule about grouping the 4 Brentwood emission sites, which is what is specifically being suggested, that would have led to 67 reasonable alternatives. And in short, I believe that is too many for a manageable, meaningful appraisal, always bearing in mind that we arrive at reasonable alternatives not only so that they can be appraised as a technical exercise, but also for consultation. The consultation is at the heart of the SCA regulations. So that's why it is a necessity to hold elements of the land supply constant across any reasonable alternatives, or what we call reasonable spatial strategy alternatives, when it comes to local plans, which almost invariably have to allocate numerous sites. But that's not spelt out in the essay reports.
So from your perspective, or from the council's perspective as well, obviously, because you're the consultant dealing with the essay, are there any aspects of the essay that you feel should be clarified? Obviously, we will come to our conclusions as to whether any additional work needs to be done on the essay to clarify any particular points. We won't be doing that today, you'll be pleased to hear. We need to go away and have a think about what we've heard, etc. Plus, there may be implications from other additional evidence that's coming in that may have an impact, etc. So we need to take that on board. But from what you've heard today and read on people's participants' regulation 19 representations and in their hearing statements, is there anything that you've heard where you thought, oh, actually, we should clarify that from the council's perspective?
So a couple of things come to mind. With regard to what is a reasonable higher growth option, it's worth being clear that, and we are clear throughout the report, that at the point of publication, we are very clear that we understood LHN, local housing needs, to be 350 dwellings per annum, but we were very alive to the possibility that LHN might increase to if it's 452 or 454. And we arrived at our understanding of what is a reasonable higher growth option. In light of that understanding, there's always arguments for exploring further higher growth options. Final point on that, though, my understanding is that the land supply position has subsequently improved since we prepared the essay report in light of most recent monitoring data. So that's the point.
That's a discussion for another day. Yes,
of course,
we're going to be discussing that now. If you to hear, yeah.
And with regards to the lengthy representations made by Thurrock Council, a lot of it amounts to more systematic appraisal. More boxes.
But does it go to the heart of the legality of the essay from your perspective? That's what I want to try and sort of tease out from the council's perspective.
No. Absolutely not. And final point on legalities, on that matter of Schedule 1, just to be clear, Schedule 1 of the SEA regulations, whilst I do maintain that it links to Regulation 9, which deals with screening, not assessment, we are naturally mindful of what is set out in Schedule 1 as part of all appraisal work. And the essay report in its 2 methodology sections does state that. We're primarily interested in Schedule 2, but we're also mindful of Schedule 1. We don't ignore it. But just to elaborate on that point about, for example, that there should be more systematic consideration of cumulative effects, more systematic consideration of short, medium, long-term effects. Our approach, and this is set out in the methodology, is that such effect characteristics will be described and discussed as appropriate, with a view to conciseness, brevity, accessibility, etc. It's our job as the essay consultants to always have those effect characteristics as listed in Schedules 1 and 2 of the SEA regulations in our minds, and to bring them to the fore as appropriate. And that's what I do. That's what colleagues do. That's what I believe we have done. And so I don't. The effect of adding more layers of systematicness would essentially be a much lengthier essay report. The essay report is 137 pages long, which you'll be aware, essay reports can stretch to over 1,000 pages. And that's our approach. Other inspectors have commented on that approach favourably, I'd say briefly, and it can be described as a narrative-based approach. It has been described in that way.
Thank you. Can I bring in Ms. Piper? I do apologise. I think you've had your hand up for a little while. Just before you start, I just want to say we will be having a break. It will be a short break, though, very shortly, and then we'll be. I'm just going to finish the essay section before we have a break. So sorry, Miss Piper, please.
Thank you. I just really wanted to add about the point about clarity on constants. The Council's document F5A, the Sustainability Appraisal Process, at paragraph 9.3, does explain the issue about how they've come across on the constants and how they've justified them. And our representations have actually suggested that something similar to that paragraph is added to the essay in section 5.5. Because it really isn't clear, and it could be made clear as part of the narrative that Mr. Fessy has just been talking about.
Thank you, Ms. Piper.
Ma'am, we'll take that on board, that observation, if it assists.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Mr. Hill, please.
Ma'am, this is just really an admin point, and I'm taking advantage of the fact that you'll have the essay open. You'll recall this morning that you and your colleague inspector were interested in where the issue of Basildon Council's unmet need was flagged up as a formal request for Brentwood to consider. This is something to have a look at, perhaps over the adjournment. The foot of page 13 of the essay document that we're looking at, and I mean here page 13 on the PDF, sets out that formal request was made, and there is a cross-reference in the footnote to 4,500 units being the scale of the unmet need at the time of the Regulation 19 process. So I'll just leave that with you and your colleague to pick up over the short adjournment.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, if I can add also, we've looked also, as I said earlier, the response to the Regulation 18 consultation, we've identified that, and that's a reference to that in here, so we can provide you with a copy of that. It's actually in the document library, but it's very hard to find because it's not numbered. So we will identify it for you.
If you can identify, that would be really, really useful. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, of course.
Thank you. Now, I would like to move on from the sustainability appraisal. I do have some other elements of statutory and legal procedures that we need to go through, which I'm hoping shouldn't take us too long, but I think we all need a bit of a break. We still have some elements to go through. So is there anything further on sustainability appraisal at this point? Obviously, this is the legal side of sustainability appraisal. I'm sure I will be discussing sustainability appraisal tomorrow yet again when I'm dealing with the spatial strategy, which I shall fully look forward to. But at this moment, anything further on the legal compliance side of the sustainability appraisal? No. Lovely. Right. Can I suggest we have a short, can we have a 15-minute break? Just so everybody can grab a drink or whatever. And it's 25 to, so if my maths are correct, can we be back here at 10 to 4, please? Thank you very much. Did I just hear correctly that, oh, is Mr. Shadarevian coming on now? Was there an issue with his computer?
Yeah, it's just restarting. He's just coming back on now.
That's fine. Might give me a chance to drink my tea for just for 1 minute. Thank you. Should we make a start? I'm just aware of the time, and if people need to. Is Mr. Shadarevian okay with that, or would he prefer us to just leave it for another couple of minutes?
I am. I'm here.
Ah, right.
I'm here. I apologise.
I'm glad to hear.
I'm really
There's now
sorry.
2 of you on the screen.
Oh, really? Oh, my goodness me. That's really bad news for everybody.
Not in terms of picture, in terms of one with a picture and one without. Oh, no, you've gone now. There you go.
Right, okay. So I had Stravinsky coming through my computer and I couldn't find a source, so I had to turn the computer off.
Thank you. These technicalities will always happen. Right. Okay, so before we had the break, I'm sure, as I said, we won't be hearing the last of about the essay this week. There will be obviously discussions about it later, particularly in relation to soundness issues later tomorrow and later in the week. But what I want to finish today on is some of the other legal and procedural requirements. Now, in relation to the habitats regulations, I don't have further questions, or we, as the inspectors, don't have further questions on this particular point. Is there anybody who wishes to make comments on our MIQs on the HRA? No, I didn't think there was, but I wanted to give the opportunity just in case. Let me just check. There's no hands up. No. Right. Thank you. In relation to consultation, and our question 7, we don't have any further queries in relation to the SCI. That was obviously the first part of the question. But we just have a couple of queries that we would just like to clarify with the council in relation to consultation on the proposed changes to the policies map, because I know that some concerns have been raised about whether clarity was given on exactly what the changes were going to be. Now, if I just set out what I understand the situation to be, and then if the council can just confirm that or clarify or correct me if obviously I've got this wrong. You state in your evidence, and particularly in your hearing statement in response to the MIQ to this particular question, that all changes to the policies map were documented in Appendix 4 of the plan and in the proposed changes to the policies map, which is document A8. This includes changes to the greenbelt boundaries. Particular point that we've wished to highlight is that in response to our initial questions, you also produced a greenbelt topic paper, which included Appendix 1, which then clarified the proposed greenbelt changes, which you state supersede the coarser and less precise scale maps as previously presented in A8. However, those proposed maps and those proposed boundary changes don't entirely tally with what was consulted on as part of Regulation 19. As additional areas, they may be small areas, but additional areas of Greenbelt, majority-wise covering roads, etc., are proposed to be removed in your newer in the newer evidence that you've proposed, but it wasn't part of your Regulation 19 consultation document. Can we just clarify that we've got that correct?
Yes,
Mr. Shadow-Revian.
Mr. Drain.
Mr. Drain, I don't mind which.
Yeah. Thank you, Inspector. That is correct. Essentially, it was a mapping issue in terms of the level of detail that was being proposed. So we tried to snap it, I think the term is, to the right boundaries according to where the lines are on the map. So that there shouldn't be any differences in terms of what we're trying to show. But just as you get into the finer grain of detail, we understand that there might be some sort of differences as to where the lines are, but the intention of where those lines should be in the first place should have been as originally proposed.
Okay. The issue that we've got with that is that the additional areas of land, those haven't been consulted on as part of the Reg 19, and therefore exceptional circumstances haven't been shown for part of that, because those weren't part of your Regulation 19. So are you still proposing that those changes form part of your sort of arguments for making those changes?
We don't feel that the additional areas of land are significant. I can just double check.
They are small areas, but they're still within the green belt, and exceptional circumstances need to be applied to those. You can't just take out land just because it may be an error, or it may be, well, that line doesn't make sense. If that's the line on the plan that's been drawn, then it needs to be consulted on. The correct boundaries need to be consulted on to ensure that everybody has had a chance to look at those boundaries. Some are over roads, which may make sense to remove them from the green belt. It may not. Some areas are smaller, maybe grass verges, for instance. So I've noticed that. But I suppose what we're saying is that we need that evidence to say why those changes need to be done, and they would need to be properly consulted on. Now that could be done potentially through main modifications. Excuse me. It's just a bit of a bugbear of mine about councils taking little bits of greenbelt. That's not the way that it's done. And I'm not saying that's what you're doing. I'm just saying that it's not been properly set out under Regulation 19. So I just wanted some clarification as to the council's way forward on that particular point, if you still feel that those areas of land need to be taken. If not, then you can keep the areas of land as they are.
It was certainly not our intention to take further land unnecessarily. I think it was more just a case of us trying to be more accurate with the lines that we were drawing. We may need to just take a view, just consider.
That's fine. That's fine. If you just want to have a look at that, it's something we'll probably come on to when we start to look at particular site allocations and specific boundaries and how that's been defined for Greenbelt anyway. So maybe we can bring that up when we discuss those elements.
Yeah,
and if you can have a way forward on that.
Okay.
It's not something that's insurmountable. It's just we would need to understand the exceptional circumstances that would be related to that, because if it's not related to the actual site, what would be the reason for removing the land out of the Greenbelt, etc. Okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you. You also refer, and again, if you can just clarify this point, you also state that other changes to the policies map are set out in different varying evidence. such as on protected lanes, allotments, the air quality management areas, etc. Can you just clarify, are these factual corrections or updates to existing boundaries? Because I'm trying to think how were they, because the changes to the policies map really should be in one place so that it's very clear to anybody consulting who wants to look at, okay, what changes are proposed to the policies map. So it's very clear. So I think you're proposing some deletions of sites, and obviously the air quality management areas have been changed. So can you just clarify exactly what, and it doesn't mean that you have to clarify it here now, but it could be something, could you just have a look at that? Were they factual corrections or?
Certainly, yeah, in terms of what we understand, they are factual corrections according to updates, for instance, for AQMAs where some have been removed, therefore they don't exist anymore. So we're just looking to reflect what the current situation is with the protected lanes,
okay,
and
if you could just clarify whether that affects in any way greenbelt boundaries. I don't think it does, but if you could just clarify that, again, that would be really useful so that assists us later on in our other session discussions. Can I just clarify, can you see me okay? Because I can put on my main light. I've just realised we've gone a bit dark. Can you see me okay?
Yep.
Okay, right, fine, thank you. Now, there have been, just on this final point on consultation, before we move on, a couple of representatives who aren't present in the session today, but they have raised queries about changes to the policies map not being available in relation to the allocation of what were protected urban open spaces. Now, I just wanted to clarify, obviously those participants aren't here, but I just wanted to clarify, because I did ask them whether they wished to attend that, because they seem to be implying that consultation wasn't carried out appropriately, but they have declined to attend, which is fine. My understanding of those queries are in relation to sites that have now been allocated, so they're protected urban open space sites previously, which I presume relates to previous local plan designations, and that they have now been allocated for land for development of some kind. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, that's fine. So there isn't an issue in relation to the changes to the policies map because that's set out in in your document.
Yes.
Because they're proposed allocations, right? Just wanted clarification on that. Thank you very much. Okay, so anything further on consultation? I don't think anybody has in this session wishes to say anything more on that. Okay. Moving on to now, in relation to question 8, the council has provided a schedule of plans and policies to be superseded by the plan. You've set those out in F19, and we've got no further questions on that, unless there is anybody here who has anything they wish to say on that, but that's a factual list. So thank you for that. That ensures that you've met that requirement. Now we come to the question relating to whether policies are strategic and non-strategic. Council, you've stated in your hearing statement that you've set out your strategic policies in Chapter 4 of the plan. You've also suggested some inclusion of policies being moved from areas later in the plan to be moved into the strategic policies section, and that's specifically PCO2 and PCO8. And you've stated that all of the policies are defined as being non-strategic. Now, we don't want to discuss the specifics of any particular policies at this stage, but we would like to understand why some are deemed to be strategic and some are not deemed to be strategic. And those that aren't, whether they should be, to ensure that the plan is sound. Now, the reasons why I'm asking this is that the plan needs to ensure that I suppose it's understanding why some of the strategic policies in the plan are strategic. So, for instance, why is the construction excuse me, management policy SPO5, why is that a strategic policy when that, to me, seems to be a development management policy that is then controlled by condition? So I'm just trying to understand, and that's just one example, the council's thinking on the strategic policies that have been set out, why they're strategic, and why other policies which are actually critical to the development of the plan, such as the Dunton Hills and other strategic policies, you've got the Brentwood Enterprise part, why they're not strategic. I'm not saying they should be at this stage, I'm just trying to understand, or we're trying to understand why. So you've got, you know, the health impact assessment policy. Why does that have to be strategic? Why is that a strategic policy? And why is Greenbelt policy, for instance, not a strategic policy? So if, I don't know who that would be to respond on that, but can you just clarify your reasoning behind strategic and non-strategic? Just on the, and I know that different councils, there's no right or wrong. I know that different councils use different approaches, and some councils call all of their policies strategic, and some councils don't. It provides clarity, particularly for any neighbourhood planning, because obviously any neighbourhood plans must be in accordance with the strategic policies. They don't have to be in accordance with the non-strategic. So how does that work in Brentwood? So is that Mr. Drain or Mr. Shadarevian?
I'll deal with it in broad terms for the moment, if I may. The essence of the strategic policies in the plan as currently drafted is that they deal with overarching issues. Now, they may be topic-based, for example, in terms of construction. They don't attempt to impose particular criteria on particular sites. Those are left to site-specific or other policies. And they are there actually operating as a framework under which other policies are derived and applied. The reason why the Dunton policy isn't a strategic policy isn't because it's not a strategic allocation, but the suite of policies under the three different core elements of the Dunton policy scheme is to deal with specific development management issues and to make sure that specific parameters are imposed at the outset and are adhered to through the process of developing the scheme and delivering the scheme. Now, it may be that sometimes it's difficult to differentiate on a higher level policies which are strategic by grouping, because some of them are more detailed than others. But the general attempt was to put those which have an overarching effect in a strategic section, and those which come under those to deal with the more specific DM aspects. And we hope that's what's been achieved. Now, I do know we are proposing to make some changes there. I hope that assists in clarifying. But if, notwithstanding what we have proposed to do, you are under the view that greater clarification can be brought and that there can be some more sifting being done, then we have no objection to that. And it's something which we could actually take into account when we come to consider the specific subject heads in due course as part of this plan, to say, look, these are the site-specific policies. How do these relate to the so-called strategic policies? Is there something we should do in order to alter the balance here or rearrange the policies in such a way that brings greater clarity and therefore effectiveness to them? We're very happy to do that. and in the same way as we have been engaged in redrafting policies to make them more effective. I'm not sure I can offer you, unless Mr. Drain wants to add to what I've said, I'm not sure there's anything more I can say other than to make sure that you are happy with the way in which the policies are both formulated and set out within the document, having regard to the requirements of the MPPF in relation to strategic policies.
I think, thank you for that, Mr. Shadoravian. That's very helpful that you're willing to have a look at that. I think it's in relation to whether the strategic policies in the plan clearly reflect the strategic priorities of the area. So are they actually being very clear and specific? And I know that by moving certain elements of the employment growth and retail development into the strategic policies, you have obviously had a look at that. But also it's about, do they reflect the strategic matters where appropriate? I'm not saying that all matters should be in there, identified through duty to cooperate, because obviously they're the strategic elements that are obviously very important in terms of the priorities of Brentwood and what Brentwood is trying to achieve through this plan. And I think possibly the greatest link is the link to your strategic objectives, because there are elements within your strategic get my teeth in a minute. These strategic objectives which don't appear in your strategic policies. So I suppose it's just having a look. I'm not saying that you necessarily do need to change anything, but I think it's something that I would, or we certainly would like you to consider. For instance, in your strategic objective, you refer to design. Now, yes, you have design policies, but they're non-strategic. But as a strategic objective, should design be an overarching? Is it so important within your strategic priorities for the area that actually you consider that's not just about development management, that's actually about that should be a strategic policy, because we would like any neighbourhood areas to ensure that that is carried forward, etc. So I think that's enough to discuss on today. I don't think we need to discuss it any further, but if you could just have a look at it, and then obviously when we get through to actually look at the policies themselves, we can maybe discuss it then.
Yeah. Well, we'll certainly make that a priority once we finish the first week and review those policies and come back with a considered response for you to consider in due course.
You may decide that you don't want to change anything, and no. I would just like to understand. I just want to get some clarity and links back to the strategic objectives and your strategic aims.
Yes, I accept that the responses you've had so far may not have served their purpose in terms of giving you the clarity you need. So we'll attempt to review that.
Thank you. That's very helpful, Mr. Shadoravian. Okay, so if we can now move on to question 10. Now, this is about the plan period. So, before I do that, I just want to go to questions 11 to 13. Now, we're not proposing to have any further discussion on those points. So unless there's anybody here now who would like to raise some queries in relation to the waste strategy, the minerals and waste local plans, and the public sector equality duty, etc., and the equalities impact assessment, I'm not proposing any further discussion. So you'll be pleased to hear that the discussion on question 10 will be the last one for this afternoon. So hopefully it shouldn't take us too long to finish. So nobody's put their hands up, so that's fine. Thank you. So if we can have a look at the plan period. Now, again, just correct us if we're wrong, but you've suggested in your hearing statement that a new strategic policy should be added, requiring that a formal review of the plan is started within 2 years of adoption. So you're talking about an early review. You've made that quite clear, and you've made it very clear in your evidence as to why you feel that you can't extend the plan period. However, and I think I'm correct on this, but again, please clarify if I'm not. In your opening statement, you specify your intention for an immediate review, which is obviously different to an early review. Can you just clarify what you mean by that?
Essentially, that the work on a review will have to start immediately in order to be in a position to produce a review in 2.5 years' time.
Does that affect the wording that you're proposing to put forward for the policy that would set out the review? Because if you're saying immediate, but in your policy you're saying it will be started within 2 years of adoption.
So, Ma'am, I'm sorry, I missed the end of your.
It's just I'm not at the moment. At the moment, we're not discussing whether this is the right approach or not. We will come on to that in a minute. I just want to clarify the council's approach first before we then discuss it and decide and have a look at whether it's the correct approach or not.
Well, it's to halve
it's the wording of the it's the wording of the changes to the it's the wording of the proposed new policy that's being suggested, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, essentially what we're doing is halving the policy requirement to review every 5 years, and we're bringing that forward. And the work to start that to bring about that review would have to start fairly soon once a plan is in place. In order to provide the intelligence we need to set out priorities, particularly in relation to any changes in the housing figure and meeting a new housing figure. So that was what was intended by the statement that we will commence work immediately. I will have another look at the proposed policy wording to make sure that what's intended is in fact given effect by the policy.
Okay, thank you for that. I suppose it could be a bit of a nuance on the different wording, but to me there's a slight difference from an early review to an immediate review. So it was that nuance in your opening statement where you referred to immediate is sort of, I went, oh, that's a little bit different. So yes, it's just providing some clarity on that.
Yeah.
If we can move on then, and just because I know there are some representatives in the room who have some concerns in relation to the plan period. So can I just, I'll bring in Mr. Banner first because you've got your hand raised, and then if anybody else wants to speak on this particular session, if you can raise your hand. So Mr. Banner, please.
Thank you, Madam. I won't repeat the points I've made earlier in a different context about the unacceptability and principle of deferral, but I simply point out that I suggest the timescale of the review, whether immediate or as originally proposed, it is highly questionable at best in terms of its realism, given that it will necessarily have to be informed on the council's own analysis by the outcome of the JSP. I mean, it's the very need to wait for the JSP to be informed by the considerations in that context of allocations of unmet need, etc., that's said to justify, we say wrongly, the kicking the can down the road of that issue. And therefore, it would be plainly premature to set ahead full steam either now or indeed in a few months or a year or so from now with preliminary work until the outcome of that process was known. And if it's said in response, well, you don't need to wait till the JSP is complete as long as you've got a clear steer, well, that rather undermines the justification put forward for not dealing with that before this plan, because you could have an MOU, as I said, as was the case in Oxford. So it does, again, it's one of those points that yet again, it's all interlinked, but there is a real question about the realism of what's being said, and yet if it's said that the early review is necessary by the council, that calls into question the principle of the overall approach.
Thank you, Mr. Banner. That reminds me of the question in relation to the JSP. What progress has been made on the JSP so far? And what's the timescales for bringing that forward?
Thank you, Inspector. We can perhaps come back to you on the timescales. there's been a significant amount of progress in the background, whilst I'm aware of the fact that what people will see in the public domain is limited. There's been a significant amount of evidence base compiled, started in terms of what we've referred to earlier on the strategic growth location study, for instance, as just one of the pieces of evidence, and trying to work through the way in which authorities can work together to sort of implement and think through the issues and the role of what the joint strategic plan will look like. So there are still some questions that remain, but there is a lot of baseline work that has been undertaken, and there is a lot of commitment from the authorities to move ahead with that. I know that chief executives, for instance, are meeting very soon to discuss the kind of contributions in terms of resources to that work to bring forward something that would be in line with what we will be publishing on how quickly that can come forward. So we would be looking at something being in the public domain by way of consultation within the next year or so. But I understand the points that have been made previously about the fact that those sorts of timeframes have been spoken about before and have not, to date, nothing's been published by way of a formal consultation. I think, our point on this issue is that whilst we recognise the importance of joint working across South Essex and the role of that, our local plan review is not dependent on the JSP in order to come forward. Whilst it provides a useful context for us to be thinking about with our partners in South Essex, if for whatever reason it does not come forward, then we are still committed to reviewing the longer term needs as we set out through a review of the local plan process. So whilst it provides a useful mechanism for us to be able to do that, it is not dependent on it.
Thank you. I'll take it in the order that I've got here. So I've got a couple of hands up. If I can come to Mr. Hill, please.
Thank you, ma'am. I've just got one introductory point, then I'm going to hand over to Mr. Stevens, who's got some further points to make. The overarching point that I want to emphasise, ma'am, is the importance in a green belt authority of ensuring one doesn't have this type of review immediately hard on the heels of the adoption of a plan. Nothing could be greater calculated to lessen public confidence in the planning system and in the robustness of the Greenbelt than having a review that commences immediately upon the adoption of a plan. This plan should look ahead to a proper period. We've set out in our hearing statements what that should comprise. And the Greenbelt should be looked at holistically, and allocation should be made to cater for the 15-year period or thereabouts that government guidance prescribes. We're way short of that. It's been made absolutely plain that the joint strategic plan isn't going to be a panacea, and there's no confidence as to how it's going to be constituted or whether it's going to have the ability to make allocations. I think it highly unlikely that the members of this constituent authorities are going to delegate their powers to make allocations to this type of plan. Brentwood needs to get its house in order now and ensure that it has a proper plan period and provides appropriately for it. I'll just hand over to Mr. Stevens, who I think has got some more technical points to make.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, thank you. Yes, I mean, I won't cover what's already been said, but just briefly, the council's, I think, principal issue is to go for the early review. But before that should be considered, I think it should be just tested in terms of their rationale for why they can't extend this plan to cover the plan period. And that appears to relate to their concern about the need to update evidence. But we've already heard, and no doubt we'll hear over the coming days, that the council's evidence base will need to be reviewed in any event. It now appears from the latest trajectory, as discussed earlier, that there is a shortfall in housing supply against the requirement, which will potentially require additional sites. So there is a piece of work for the council to do over the coming months to address these issues, which could well address an extended plan period. So I think that should be explored further with the council before we jump to the conclusion of an early review. And just in that regard, I won't repeat the points, but there is a real concern here about the potential overlap with the JSP. and the fact that the one process will be used as an excuse to stall the other. If a JSP is allocating growth between the authorities, how can a plan review plan for a housing requirement when the housing requirement can only be settled through the JSP? It is inevitable that the plan review will stall and will delayed whilst the JSP progresses, and that, in our written evidence to you, ma'am, could have significant consequences for meeting housing needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stevens. Mr. Kimblin, please.
Thank you very much indeed. Just to associate myself with the points just made by Mr. Stevens, what one really does risk is an excess of politeness in the coming years, where one authority simply says, no, no, after you, no, no, after you. And that will be a very significant risk which we face. Rather, we would submit that the appropriate response here is to grasp the issues now and be in a position to put in place that which this authority has waited for such a long time, something which is robust and addresses need fully, and rolling forward the housing numbers and addressing the housing needs in that way by extending the plan period is, for the reasons also identified, if I may say so, very clearly by Mr. Hill. We would also support of the options, neither of which is really desirable. Of the options, we would urge upon you extending the plan period.
Thank you. There's nobody else at the moment who wishes to add to that conversation. Can I come back to the council on the points that have been made? Oh, Mr. Stebbing, do you want to add to the comments that have been made, please?
There's not much I can add, Madam, to what's in our hearing statements on this. I think the issue for you as inspectors is to test the strength of commitment that's being suggested by Mr. Shadarivian in terms of the timescale. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Gimby, please.
Just briefly, ma'am, thank you. I just wanted to make a couple of short points. The first is, I don't think anyone around the virtual table has highlighted a legal reason why the council should seek to extend the plan period rather than commit to an immediate early review, as the case may be. And indeed, there is no such legal reason. We would be concerned about the implications which would flow from extending the plan period in circumstances where, as Mr. Banner has pointed out, there is a need now to house people now. And we would be concerned about potentially delaying the adoption of this plan by having to extend the plan period, which would necessitate, we suspect, a new sustainability appraisal to take into account the extended plan period. And we just don't think there's any justification for it. In terms of the point about, well, there would be some sort of polite, you go first, no, you go first. Well, it would be in this council's best interest to expedite a plan in circumstances where it has a policy requiring it to do so, because if it fails to do so, they'd be vulnerable to arguments that the plan is out of date if they are not acceding to expediting their local plan review in the way that the court held in the context of decorum. So I think that needs to be borne in mind as well by way of context to the points that are being made. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Gimby. I would like some clarity, because we have raised concerns about the relationship between the JSP and the local plan, and you're saying that one doesn't follow the other, but we are concerned about if the JSP is supposed to be setting out the overarching strategic policies, or certain elements of the strategic matters, how does the local plan fit into that in terms of ensuring that there is parity with that? Now, I understand you're going to give us an indication of timescales, and it sounds obviously at the moment you're producing the evidence at the moment for that for the JSP. So it's obviously at a very early stage. So I would imagine it's quite a way off then, isn't it, in relation to the JSP coming forward for any public consultation? And I'm just a little bit trying to understand how that works then with the, you say that the review of the local plan the JSP wouldn't have any impact on that, but I don't see how that can be the case when the JSP would form part of the development plan for the locality.
Yeah,
so I'm just trying to understand that. So could you just explain that?
Yeah, Inspector, I probably didn't make myself clear. I think my point was, in a world where the JSP does not come forward, the Brentwood local plan is not dependent. It is delayed, or for whatever reason there is no JSP. That would not take away from the fact that we are committing to look at and think about the longer term implications of what development needs would be in the area. Clearly, in a situation where the JSP comes forward in terms of the timescales that we're looking at, our local plan process would need to integrate with that, as has been raised by people in the session. So in that sense, the timescales of it, I think, would align, although I need to double check in terms of making sure that we can give you an up-to-date picture on what those look like from a JSP perspective. We would likely be looking at some form of formal consultation in terms of the first stage of that within the next year, which would mean the point at which we would, be underway looking at the future Brentwood local plan. So I think that they could come forward concurrently, but clearly what we should do is come back to you with our understanding right now of what those timescales look like.
Okay, yeah, if you could, and clarify what you mean by first stage of consultation as well. There isn't a requirement to do lots of different types of consultation before you do your actual submission version.
No, I understand that. I think in terms of the timescales, we can clarify the stages.
Yeah, but yes, there isn't a requirement to do that. Okay, thank you for that. I think on that basis, this could be something that we need to return to be fair, based on us understanding where the JSP is, etc., and how that works. It's certainly something we won't be considering the main modification as to whether this is appropriate or not, and whether it should be a main modification in terms of an early review or an immediate review until much later in the hearing process. So we will, at the end of the process, be setting out some time to go through all of the main modifications to make sure that only those that are appropriate or not. And by that stage, we may have come to a view, we may not have come to a view by then. So I'm certainly not going to, we're certainly not going to provide a view at this stage. I'm not proposing to necessarily discuss that matter any further. As I said, I think it's something, it's all set out in the representations that are before us. It's certainly something that we will need to give some direction on eventually. As to whether we consider the council's approach is sound, or whether we consider another approach is necessary to ensure soundness of the plan, etc. Are there any further points that anybody wishes to raise on overall on legal compliance on this issue 2 matter? Mr. Warden, is there anything further you want to raise, having listened to the discussion this afternoon?
No, thank you, Mrs. Wright.
Okay, lovely, thank you. I know we'll go and have our little chats afterwards, as we do, so that's always enlightening. Right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. That's been really useful this afternoon. Thank you very much for your patience. I know we've gone slightly over what we anticipated, but it's still only around 4:30, so that's not bad by my books. I have done much later sessions, so that's an early one for me, so that's a win-win. We will be back here tomorrow, 9:30, spatial strategy, so look forward to it. So thank you very much. We'll certainly take your comments on board. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mum.